Hello, everyone. Settlers Lament here, and we're joined today by Sargon of Akkad, as you can see, and Charlemagne, of course. And today we'll be discussing Moldbug and the Cathedral, just going through some of the basic concepts on those topics. Um, and yeah, that's basically it. The reason why, particularly why we're having this discussion, is recently Sargon has discovered Moldbug. I noticed that he was talking about him on some live streams. The first one I think was with Louis Lavaux. And Sargon, you are probably not entirely aware of this, but Moldbug's a really big figure in our circles. Charlemagne here has made a large series on him. I've made a couple videos too. And our mutual friend Distributist also has made several videos. So he's a big figure. So I thought it'd be interesting to have a discussion on some of these ideas.
I assume when you say our circles, what do you mean by that? Is it? I assume I'm in like Catholic Twitter sphere, that sort of area.
Yeah, more or less. I mean, there are some non-Catholics, but yeah.
But the ethos of it is what you're speaking to.
I would say the reactionary right in general. I don't really include myself in Catholic circles so much. I mean, I am a Catholic, but that's not really the focus of what I do, and I leave that to more qualified people. Moldbug is actually fairly popular among the libertarian right at the moment, which is quite interesting as well. Although not surprising, as Moldbug himself was a libertarian of the Hoppian variety in particular.
I just want to be clear. I haven't read anything by him. I'm coming on to learn today. So you guys, if you'd like to teach me, I'm more than willing to hear what your interpretation is. But I haven't read him myself just because I haven't had time. I'm currently writing a big thing about white fragility. And unironically, she's calling out the Jews. It's hey, I'm not joking, right? Listen, I'll give you the exact quotes. She says, here we go. All right, so she's talking about the richest Americans, and so she just goes through these numbers. And one of the most potent ways that white supremacy is disseminated through media representations, and we have a profound impact on how they see the world. We see the world. Those who write and direct films are our cultural narrators. They tell the stories that shape our worldviews. Okay, so she's calling out Hollywood. What director, what actor, what writer is she speaking about there? But she's erasing the Jewish worldview, the Jewish experience. I found a paper on, I can't remember what university website it was, but it was by two guys it was two academics who were just discussing how essentially Hollywood was founded and created by Jews who were fleeing from persecution in Europe. And it was in the age of silent film, and this very beginning of the 20th century, and how they were the right people in the right place at the right time to do it. And it's okay, this all makes sense. And so, I mean, she's actually got a problem with the way that the Jews present the world on screen. And apparently some farmer in the Midwest is equally as culpable. And I'm sorry, I just don't think that's very accurate or very fair. I think that erases lots of people's perspectives and things like this. So there are lots of criticisms I have of all this. Sorry, I know I'm going off on a tangent now, but it's just been in my mind and it bothers me. It's like, why? It's so skin deep. I hate it. Anyway, so yeah, Moldbug, tell me. The only thing that I've really read about Moldbug is his theory on the cathedral, but I think it's broadly accurate.
Yeah, so I guess the broad concept of the cathedral in 2020 is more or less kind of a mainstream concept at this point, even if people don't, have the full tool set of words for it. But just for everyone listening, the cathedral, in summary, is essentially a distributed power structure that has no central core to it, that basically forms the basis for an atheistic religion. And we would call this probably progressivism or something like that, maybe globalism or internationalism, take your pick. And that the cathedral is describing this decentralized system of universities, media, and government power structures all working in tandem to promote this atheistic religion.
But the one thing I'd like to so I really feel that this is not using the best terminology because it kind of otherizes social justice as something unique. But really, it's very much like the Catholic Church. You know, it really is. It's a worldview. It's a belief system. It's not, you know, it's not like a secular religion. It's just a belief and a set of beliefs that are based on a set of values. Like if in, you know, medieval Europe, a Muslim arrived and, you know, in Rome and then said, right, I want to set up a mosque, it would be very much the same reaction as if in a university a Trump supporter said, I'd like to set up a Trump, you know, vote Trump stall or something like this. You know, you get exactly the same reaction because it's two different belief systems that are coming into conflict and it's in the domain of the one belief system over the other. But I think that it's important just not to. The problem I have with the way Moldbug phrases it is it otherizes social justice as if this is a unique phenomenon. That's how it sounds, anyway.
Well,
that's a very astute observation you make, and
thank you.
That is actually kind of the point of referring to it as a religion, to sort of point out how it operates in a way that's near identical to previous religions, just without the God part. But in the way that it operates in our day-to-day lives, in the way the worldview affects us, the God part isn't really that meaningful. The prescriptions are and how society's organized is what's meaningful.
Yes,
and it operates in a very similar way. That's why he refers to it as a no God religion.
But I agree with you that I think it is a mainstream concept at this point because you can't see all of these different companies who are theoretically in competition with one another, you know, agreeing with, you know, the activists, the activists in university, a bunch of left-wing, you know, all the left-wing politicians, all the corporations, anyone, you know, the main, you know, anywhere you go, you can't be on the opposite side of it. And, you know, you can't say that's not an identifiable thing, you know.
So I want to catch on this idea here. So you are correct, and this is one of the reasons why Moldbug's blog is so interesting. I mean, for one, this was written. He was identifying this way back in 06, 08, before Obama was even president, which is interesting. But second, Moldbug actually doesn't otherize modern progressivism. In fact, exactly the opposite. And so a lot of people who have a cursory understanding of the Cathedral, which is fine, won't realize that Moldbug spends like maybe 100 pages of ebook or so in his open letter, basically deriving modern progressivism as a sort of hyper-Protestant sect of the original Protestant settlers of America, and links it very directly to that tradition. If you basically trace the lineage of progressivism all the way back to the American Revolution, there's a direct line to Puritanism and Calvinism in particular. So Moldbug actually doesn't otherize the modern incarnation of what he might call Whiggery, but actually connects it directly to the original Whig Party in Britain and the United States.
Right. Okay. No, that's good. That's good because another thing that I've been trying to, whenever these conversations come up with people, I've been trying to make people understand that like all of these are localized phenomena, right? As in social justice warriors are a product of the English-speaking, progressive, liberal, you know, Western establishment. This is the philosophy that has undergirded it has led to. I think that there are certain almost predestined places it can lead to, and this is one of them. And it's effectively the communist position, the fascist position, and the liberal position is essentially the limits of the Enlightenment, I think. And so I think that it's inevitable, you know, that these things will come up. Not that they'll win or anything like that. Who knows what wins in the end? But it's inevitable that these come up and we have to deal with them.
Right, and the people in them, it's such a natural and invisible process of evolution that people don't even realize that they're part of this movement. And I think that's actually good for us. Moldbug's a big fan of James Burnham, and I've read a little bit of Burnham recently. If you're familiar with,
I'm not, but can I give you guys a theory that I've been working on?
Sure.
Since I feel like I've got an appropriate audience. So it's one of those things. Not that I think that people wouldn't understand or anything, but I think people wouldn't be interested in talking about it in these terms, right? But I've noticed that essentially the Enlightenment is kind of a reverse process. It begins with complaints about physical oppression and physical conditions, very consequentialist things. This is wrong. And then the procedure has to be established. And I think now we've moved entirely into the a priori sort of Kantian area of moral legislation, where things are good or bad purely by their definition. And the connection to the contingent is essentially irrelevant now. The video I did on Riley Dennis, and Lindsay Ellis the other day, it really got me thinking, because the idea that because the physical is malleable and modifiable and not eternal, that it's somehow invalid, which was Riley's contention. Chromosomes do nothing because we can change your body with hormones. We can, modify you with surgery and stuff like this. Therefore, that none of, there's no such thing as biological sex or anything like that. Then you're talking about like this realm of the kind of absolute freedom of the will that is defined by very rigid rules that don't have to have any direct connection to reality. And reality is essentially getting in the way of that. It's the thing that prevents the perfection from being achieved. And the more I've been thinking about it, it's like, what else would you expect from the internet? It's not surprising to me that this ideology has flourished in the age of the internet, because all you can do on the internet is argue. You can't do any of the contingent things that you would otherwise do in real life. And so you look at the way people talk to each other on Twitter, man. No one would talk to anyone like that if they were standing in front of them in real life, because there would be fists flying really quickly, But so it all becomes definitional and abstract and very, very fast, because all of the definitions essentially contain within them the consequent, like the knock-on from the logical pattern that they've been following. They're all contained within this. So it just requires you to think your way through them. And so that can happen very, very quickly when you've got millions of people all on Twitter on the mob. Blah, blah, blah. And so suddenly you get to everything is white supremacy. All lives matter is racist. It's what Nazis say. And it's just like, you hear people saying it, and you see people saying it, you think, Christ, that's a hell of a radical opinion that they've arrived at really swiftly. So what do you guys think?
This concept of, I guess, the internet leading to this outcome, I think, does fit into
strengthening it. I think I'd say it's given the definitional, the argumentation, a lot more strength than it would have outside of the internet. I think
strengthening it, and accelerating it. In fact, which, and this sort of ties into, I guess, the other side of neo-reaction, which is the Nick Landian accelerationist side, who's quite an interesting philosopher in his own right. In this stream, we're mainly focused on Moldbug, but there's actually several different corners of neo-reaction. There's also this accelerationist angle, and I think what you're saying there is exactly what you'd expect to happen and continue happening. And the problem is difficult to address. The way Nick Land would describe how to address it is we simply have to go through it, burn out to the end of the process. And I kind of do think that's really the only way forward. There is no stopping the internet. There is no going back. We are living in a very postmodern condition, and we do actually have to work our way through that. And that's a difficult challenge. That's a difficult problem. I don't know how to do it, but I think we do have to accept the state of affairs that we live in now, and actually figure out how we're going to manage these interactions with each other, so that we don't end up caught up in this cycle that causes these problems we see today. Like you mentioned, everything is white supremacy now. Like we need to exist in this new world without getting to that conclusion, and that's a very difficult problem that I don't have the answer to.
I do think that the social justice argument is effectively undefeatable at the moment. None of them, like the argument itself is so manifestly wrong, but it's not wrong in a way that they understand, because they're cutting out reality. They're talking entirely in abstractions, in my opinion. So I kind of see the merit to the idea of let it burn out, and in fact it would be better if it burned out as quickly as possible, does the damage that it's going to do on the smallest scale it can do, and then we can rebuild afterwards. I really can see the merit to that argument.
Yeah, that's kind of where I am right now, and
Yeah.
I think
I mean,
Nick
Barry Weiss just resigned from the New York Times because of social justice bullying her, and she didn't name one of the bullies or the ideology that was bullying her. And it's like, dude, we all know, just say it, name it, so we can talk about it, But until then, But anyway, sorry, carry on. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Sure, yeah. Well, I would say not only, I guess, should we allow the process to burn itself out so much as there's not even a choice in the matter, right? This process is going to burn itself out and continue to accelerate towards that end, whether we like it or not. And that's the condition we need to be preparing for. It's not so much, I think, how do we stop social justice, so much as it is how do we survive this process. It's the process itself that is the problem, not the particularities of social justice.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that position. I do think that it is important that we survive it. I even think it's important we stay on these platforms. That's one of the reasons I'm most concerned about deplatforming. Building up other platforms is fine, but this should never have happened. And if we can survive it, it looks I think it's just generally good for everyone. There was something else I was going to say there, though, that was going to contradict myself, basically. But probably something along the lines of it would just be better for us to get it over with, man.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the issue with progressivism is it's such a totalizing worldview that, like, the way that it's presented to us is that mainstream politics is as if these are just like two relatively different, two sides that aren't that different that we can debate, but that's not really what's going on. These are really two religious conflicts. It's like a metaphor that Moldbug uses is it's like going to medieval Europe and trying to explain to a peasant there that like everything he knows is just completely wrong. Like in the abstract, you might be able to do that, but like, how could you actually just teleport there and try to, with their entire life being dominated by one totalizing worldview, try to convince them out of that?
And it's not just the worldview either. It's worse than being a worldview, right? Because like, if I woke up on an alien spaceship or something, and the alien sat there going, "Well, actually, the world as you understood it wasn't real," I'd be like, "Christ, that's weird." But I wouldn't think, right now, I don't know how to be a good person, right? But when you challenge the worldview, that the way that the progressives are doing, what you're doing is you're undermining a person's moral values, their moral structure. So now, what essentially the progressives have done is not just invalidated how they would have behaved going forward, but also their own sense of moral decency as the decisions that they've made using the framework they've got to get the outcomes that they expected have all been wrong. So it's total invalidation of them of everyone else's moral worldview. And so I think it's really that's why it's so powerful. People are afraid of that, and then if they're just going to be like, no, we'll teach you how to be a good white person. Fucking hell.
So this actually one of the things we can talk about here is how Moldbug frames this religious problem. So there's kind of there are a lot of interesting language tricks being played in modernity. And this is something I think the Distributist has observed and made some very good videos on. So one of the things Moldbug points out is that, we have this concept of theism and atheism, right? So you could be a polytheist, a monotheist, an atheist. You can also have, and this isn't a trick question, you can have a religion, right? What's the word? A religion has a god in it. What's the word for a no-God religion?
Well, I mean, I guess we'll have to say secular or atheistic religion. But I don't agree that a religion necessarily needs a god.
You're right.
Because I think the way that I've been conceptualizing it, I think I'm actually very much on the same page when it comes to your analysis. I don't know what your solutions are or anything like that, but when it comes to the analysis, I've been exactly on these points. I've been using the term moral origin for when I've been conceiving of these things. So rather than saying, it's God, obviously in religious parlance, it's God. But in the secular progressive parlance, it's the individual. The progressive individual is the moral origin, and them Kantian moral legislators. In the same way that a priest would be the moral legislator for God. And they are actually trying to kind of find a secular analog for the perfect will, the divine mind, and it's another way of essentially going about the same thing. So you don't really need a separate name for them. You are dealing with the origin of morality, what gives it authority, what gives it the power that it has, and yeah,
you're right. And I don't think Moldbug thinks we need another word for this particular progressive religion so much as recognizing there's a certain language trick happening that sort of gets in the way of
basically what I've been.
Yeah, exactly. And another place this ties into is so we basically have this concept where, at the end of World War II, there was essentially one ideology that basically won, which is liberal democracy. And we basically, through that process, the outcome that's been taught in the Western world is that this is the correct 100% accurate and moral ideology, right? Like through the fact of conquest, progressivism is viewed to be correct. And
well, I don't think it would be called progressivism as progressivism is understood now. I don't think that's fair. But I think what it was unwitting. In some ways, I think the post-war era is naive in the extreme. Who Francis Fukuyama, wasn't it, who said the end of history and things like this? But I think that was a genuine kind of attitude they had. They thought, we've won and that's it. And it's like, no, it's never it, So I think essentially the communists won. We weren't looking out for them. McCarthy was considered to be a brute. It's like, well, he doesn't look such a brute now, does he? But I mean, if you disagree, let me know. I might be wrong.
No, I agree with that. I just don't know that I would necessarily frame it that way, at least not in the context I'm getting at. So one of the thing Moldbug does, and he's doing this recently in his Clear Pill series, which kind of reiterates some of these concepts, is he basically takes, I guess you could say, an alien perspective on these ideologies. So if you take yourself out of the liberal democracy and just observe communism, fascism, liberal democracy all on their own, and actually take an outsider perspective on these things, you can sort of see through the religious indoctrination elements of each of these ideologies and analyze them for what they are. And it's interesting because Moldbug basically comes out in the open letter as being anti-communist, anti-fascist, and anti-liberal democracy. And this is the fundamentally reactionary position. The alternative to these is not the ancien regime, but some form of that he's currently calling neo-monarchy. And what neo-monarchy is essentially is having a CEO, right? The idea of a king is kind of archaic. But the way I think most neo-reactionaries would see their ideal form of government as is having the country being run by a CEO, because the government is a corporate body like all corporations. And everyone sort of accepts and realizes that corporations would be a complete disaster if they were run democratically, especially in the universal type of democracy we have. It's obvious that corporations need leaders who have executive power, but are still accountable to someone, right? So a CEO is accountable to a board. And the neo-monarchist or neo-cameral position, however you want to phrase it, is essentially taking this view on how government should be arranged. It should be arranged primarily to create order. And that's what a CEO does, who has complete executive power, but is ultimately still accountable to the shareholders of the company, or in this case, the country. And
so essentially you just want to recreate a feudal nobility.
Not precisely in those terms.
But
effect. I would say not exactly. I think we do want aristocratic leaders, not in this purely blood lineage sense, but people who are elite, competent, and that's why CEOs are placed in their position. One cute example he uses in the open letter is, would you rather live in California or Applefornia, which is run as a for-profit corporation back when Steve Jobs was still the CEO, right?
Yeah. before Apple went fully woke.
Yeah, exactly. So think about 2008 Steve Jobs. Apple's at the height of its
Entrepreneurial,
innovation. And I don't really care for Apple that much, and I don't think any of us particularly like California, but I would kind of have to agree with his analysis that I would rather live in Applefornia than California.
So I guess the first and probably most obvious criticism that springs to mind is what prevents the problems occurring that the Enlightenment was designed to solve?
I think some form of the same mechanism that the original founders of the United States implemented, which is to have. There's this view that Moldbug's put forward recently that the term president actually predates government. It's actually was originally the term for the leader, the executive of a company.
Yeah.
And a lot of the founders of the United States were actually, businessmen.
Yeah.
And if you actually examine what they set up, it appears that what they were setting up or trying to set up may have been some form of accountable monarchy, is one way you could phrase it. So where does the accountability come in? It comes from some body of managers or shareholders, which in this case would be Congress, and it's also divided into the Supreme Court. In the neo-monarchist case, it would just be in a body of shareholders who basically appoint a president, and the president is given complete executive power, just like in a company. But of course, that CEO can be fired if he doesn't run the company particularly well. And obviously, this wouldn't be a perfect system. There is no perfect system.
No, of course.
Mistakes would be made.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be in the interest of AmeriCorp or Applefornia to run the country into the ground. If you're running it essentially as a for-profit enterprise, you have a responsibility over your country or company in the same way you would over your actual corporation. And the reason that accountability, I think, would actually work is because what this is essentially doing is instituting Moldbug's concept of formalism. So the problem we have now is there's this separation of power and responsibility where, people have power, but they're not responsible for anything. You can think of Congress. Like we have this idea of Congress.
I totally agree. You'd have to persuade me.
Right. So
there's such little accountability these days. That's disgusting.
So consider Apple, right? Steve Jobs is
how do you
ultimately accountable. Everyone knows he's accountable. And if he does a really bad job, which he did in the past, if we recall, he will be fired, right? And someone else will be appointed to run that enterprise. And you would basically see the same thing in this sort of neo-monarchist state. Now, this concept isn't meant to be some sort of totalitarian concept. This concept is usually paired with this concept of patchwork or exit. And essentially the ideal vision would be having, if you consider all the different principalities in Europe or even lower divisions in the United States, the ideal would be to have this patchwork system of very small sovereign corporations, which is essentially what a government is already, and allow your citizens to basically pick whichever country they wanted to live in, assuming it accepted them as an immigrant, right? So no country ought to prevent their citizens from leaving. You should be free to exit. This is an essential libertarian concept, exit. You should be free to exit your society and seek a new, better one. And basically this process, if implemented, would actually result in having the best run companies or countries outcompete the worst run ones, which would obviously be the communists, right? They would be outcompeted very easily. And then that's essentially how the system of accountability would work in a neo-monarchist patchwork system.
Right. Okay. So I think my problem, my initial objection would probably be that doesn't sound accountable enough. It sounds quite indirect. I don't know what the mechanism for, assuming I'm not a shareholder in this company, I don't know what I can do to get something done. But as a voter, I can at least say I'm going to vote for a candidate who's going to say, who's going to do this thing. As unreliable as liberal democracy is, it feels like a more direct route. I mean, I can quite easily see all of these corporate states getting co-opted by something like social justice or Islam. And if the cathedral in each one, the belief system that's running each one, doesn't agree that I deserve a voice, then I won't get one.
Indeed, and actually, you ideally wouldn't have a voice in one of these societies, right? Well, and this is kind of a fundamental.
But that doesn't. How is that ideal? Like, what's ideal about that?
So, I wouldn't say it's necessarily an ideal. Like having voice in itself could be ideal, but in place of voice, you could also have exit. One of the problems we have in the modern world is there is no exit. There's nowhere really else to go because the whole world is used up at this point. So we don't have any exit. Your options.
Well, I mean,
I
don't know if I agree with that. I mean, come
okay.
on. There are lots like obviously you're not just going to carve off a piece of territory, but like
right,
you as an individual or a community could move somewhere. I mean, Ghana's begging for Black Americans to move back to Ghana, or not back. They've never been there, but like to move to Ghana because they want the human capital. There's the world's a big place.
Fair enough. There is some degree of exit, right? But in neo-reaction, you basically have these three components of how you get to live in the society you want. There's either exit, voice, or regime change. And regime change can happen in a non-messy way, but it's usually pretty messy.
Yeah.
True exit. I mean, you do have options where you can live now, right? But they're pretty low on the list of desirable places to live, right? So
that's true. Yeah.
Despite all of the problems in the United States and Europe right now, I still wouldn't want to live in Ghana. But at the same time, we're kind of all experiencing this tyrannical system. So, I think if we felt like we had exit, probably all of us would go somewhere better at this point. But
well, to be honest with you, for me, it's kind of a moral issue. I don't want to not live in England. I like England. There are particular things about it that I prefer over other places in the world, and I've been to quite a lot of the world now. And yeah, I've made my choice. So I would like to be able to make sure that the place I live in is as conformable to my ideals as possible, especially as my ideals aren't particularly radical when it comes to the traditional sort of like English political thoughts. And I would rather get rid of the interlopers,
Yeah, I actually agree with you completely. And this is, I guess, what I was getting at is, when I think of exit, I'm thinking of pioneers leaving England to go build England 2.0. Right?
Yeah.
But that's the thing that you can't really do anymore unless you go to Antarctica or something, right? Like there's not all the sovereignty is taken up.
There's no colonizable land, yeah.
Precisely, if you want to put it that way.
That's what we're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, and okay, so there's exit, right? We also have voice. The problem with the voice is we have basically fake voice right now in government. Like we all, and this is kind of the problem with the current liberal democratic system from the neo-reactionary perspective is the whole participation in the democratic process is basically a fake pressure release valve. It's a means of having the voters, feel like they're actually influencing power when in fact they're more or less just sort of shifting around these representatives who don't actually hold the real power anyway, particularly in the United States.
That may be true in the United States, but in Britain, I think that there are. I mean, Brexit is something that is. I mean, Brexit and Trump, honestly, kind of reaffirmed my faith in liberal democracy. The fact that people can actually vote for things that the powers that be don't want and start getting them. As limited as those things have been, and I concede that. I mean, had we some based dictator, things could be done a lot quicker. But I'm happy to be an incrementalist in that regard.
Well, I mean, it barely even feels incremental. It seems like the changes have been almost entirely subverted. At least in the in the United States with Trump, his immigration agenda has been, I mean, not entirely destroyed, but he's been able to get very, very little done.
Yeah, I mean, he has reduced immigration, but not to significant levels, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Um,
and
yeah, and we
virtually no
probably won't
progress
in
on
this
the wall.
country either. But I think that we can continue making a stronger case now that we've got people at least moving in the right direction. As unsatisfying as it is at this point, it's still moving in the right direction, and
Well,
that's why. Sorry, go on.
sorry.
No, you
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, I mean, I'm not sorry if this is friendly fire for my co-host, but I'm not 100%
No.
sold on the concept of neocameralism.
Mhm.
I'm more into Moldbug for his analysis of power.
Yeah.
But I think the fundamental issue is that we can't get any change done until the cathedral, the stranglehold they have over everything is destroyed.
Yeah. That's true.
Until and that really, I'm not quite sure how we do that. That's obviously the $1 million question. But until their power is usurped
Yes.
or gotten rid of, there's no way we can ever get the change we actually want done.
Yeah. I mean that's absolutely accurate. The cathedral is in control of such a large amount of public life at the moment. Again, Barry Weiss is just probably the current highest profile example of what's going on, but it's acting and everyone can see it and they should be able to name it. The only way you can actually start removing communist agitators and revolutionaries from our institutions is by identifying them as such, and that's what they are. And I really think we've got to be bold about saying, look, they're communists. It has to become a dirty word again. They rehabilitated it. It's not on.
So on this ruthless incident of friendly fire, I would say I don't particularly classify myself as a neo-cameralist or neo-monarchist. I think it's an interesting idea, and honestly would probably be preferable. It's probably fairly unrealistic, but mainly I just wanted to put that out there as an explanation of where Moldbug's coming from.
Right. Well, I mean it's good. It's good as an explanation of where he's coming from because because I don't, no one knows anything about Mencius Moldbug, but they hear, neo-reactionary and think, oh God. But honestly, that just sounds, I'm like you say, he was a libertarian because it sounds like a direct evolution of libertarian thought.
It is.
And it obviously is. It's corporatized. That's fine because you can explain that this is not an attempt at fascism, although I have to say it's not going to look that pretty in my opinion. I don't think it's totalitarian. I think that there will be people who won't really have much to do with the government at all, but I think that might be a problem because I think there are some people who do need the government's help. But anyway, just to clear up, I'm not I'm not a progressive. I could talk to people I disagree with. But yeah, so the way I've been thinking about it, I think from what I've seen of Moldbug's view, I think that, like you say, his power analysis is good, and I think that his moral analysis in the cathedral is excellent. That is a mapping of the moral landscape. He does, I think, a fine job. I've only read people who are talking about him, but from what they've said about him, he seems to be right on the money there. But I've been thinking about this as well. Like, I can see. I don't think we can just otherize the Enlightenment, right? I don't think you can propose to someone something that will eventually sound like neo-feudalism and think that the concerns and values of the Enlightenment become irrelevant. Like I talked to a chap on Twitter who's like, liberalism is the problem. Liberalism is the problem. He's a hardcore traditionalist. I'm like, mate, liberalism was invented by the English. This is an English ethnic idea. This wasn't something that just came out of nowhere, and it arose to solve problems and to satisfy needs that were present in that population. It was quite evolutionary, and so the sort of neo-reaction types are like, no, we have to reject the Enlightenment. That's not possible. Like, it's so baked into people's worldview and moral philosophy that they would see you as being a tyrant just on the face of it, and they'll reject you out of hand. What needs to happen, I think, is a synthesis between the sort of more traditional understanding that the nobility do have obligations to the peasantry and the personal freedoms that were gained from the Enlightenment. A reasonable synthesis of the two, I think, is possible. I think Tucker Carlson's coming closest to it at the moment.
So I would say that you're not going to get modern people probably anyone alive to really reject the Enlightenment wholesale, except for
No.
maybe a few ideologues, right?
Yeah.
But we do want to be careful getting into end of history territory here, because I think ultimately any value system with enough time can be overturned. And
totally. Just to be clear, I wasn't thinking of some kind of end of history thing. I was just thinking, to me, it's morality is like technology. It's constantly evolving, and it's constantly evolving to fit the circumstance in which people find themselves. They need to justify why they're doing what they do to stay alive. So when I, say like a sort of Hegelian synthesis, I'm not saying that that's the end of it. That's just the next step, because the imperfections within whatever system you create are what create the opposition that then has to synthesize into the next system. So I wasn't trying to say end of history or anything like that.
Okay.
Well, I'd say what I definitely agree with you on is it's impossible to really go back. The developments that have happened, we can't ignore them. Like the Enlightenment happened. You can't pretend that it didn't.
Yeah.
And any moral explanation going into the future needs to take that into account and integrate it in some way.
Exactly. That's exactly.
Yeah, and I think neo-reaction does basically accept that, and isn't looking to go back to some former system so much as examine the positives of the pre-Enlightenment system in terms of its ability to establish order, as opposed to the modern conception of government.
Yep.
And the reason Moldbug does this is because Moldbug is I think primarily interested in liberty. And I think he gets this idea from Thomas Carlyle. Carlyle wrote that liberty is basically a consequence of order, and I think we would all basically agree with that. You can't have liberty without some sort of order to protect you from chaotic forces that would otherwise infringe on your rights. Like this is a very Lockean conception.
No, I've been thinking about this a lot too, and I think you've got that exactly right. And I think that tying liberty to order is very important because it's freedom to something, right? And so to make sure that there's something to be there, you have to have a certain kind of order that construct like free. You might have the freedom to use a public health service or something, but you need a certain kind of order that can create a public health service, or the liberty to do that. You're at liberty to do the thing. And I think that it's important because I think it's different to the word freedom, which generally, in my opinion, seems to be the absence of coercion. So a man who's left alone on his own on an island is free, but he's not at liberty, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good conception, and I would say as an American, I have this interest as well, right? Like my interest in neo-reaction isn't because I'm an edgy boy monarchist and just want a king or something, right? I'm fundamentally interested in living in a just and orderly and a society that provides me with a certain degree, of liberties within reason. Obviously, there are strictly immoral activities that
would it be fair to summarize it as a society in which you are able to choose a destiny you want, even if I don't know. I had a better way of framing that a minute ago in my head because it was something that previously popped up in my mind when we were talking a second ago, but I've kind of lost the formulation I had. But
self-actualization.
A society in which you are able to self-actualize. Like the way I was thinking is basically there's more than one way to skin a cat. I would be open to anti-enlightenment ideologies if I could be sure that they were going to provide me with the personal liberty that I have now. I don't see what the problem would be. I'm not. It's not the it's more consequentialist in my view that I'm looking for. I don't have a particular a priori structure as how something should be before we hit reality. I'm happy to work with something that works, but I'd have to be given a fairly good schematic before I'd recommend it.
Yeah, and this is why I like the reactionary or neo-reactionary position, because I think it does accept and seek to adapt and coexist with reality, whereas leftism or progressivism is involved in essentially this endless struggle with reality, which is a battle that can never be won. And this is something that Moldbug identifies in the open letter. he tries to analyze. He tries to be very fair to progressives. It is an open letter to open-minded progressives, after all. And he basically asks the questions: why does progressivism lead to chaos and disorder? We don't just want to say that progressives want chaos and disorder. That wouldn't be fair to them as their motivation.
Yeah.
The reasoning behind this is they're fighting against reality itself, and they always view the current order as being in the way of their utopian ideal that they're seeking. And thus they engage in an endless struggle against the existing order, which is why progressivism always produces chaos and disorder. It's because they're fundamentally opposed to reality itself. And I think this is where neo-reactionaries especially separate from the
before we move on from that point, just to be clear, that's what I mean when I say that they exist in the realm of definition. Entirely like they have calculated their politics separately and prior to looking at the world, and so obviously the world doesn't look like that they expect, so the entire thing is terrible. And you're exactly right, they will be forever struggling against material reality entirely.
This is, going back to the point from before, that progressivism appears to be a direct descendant of New England Puritanism. This is actually an even more ancient impulse in Christianity. It's essentially Gnosticism. You can see this most clearly with the trans stuff. The idea that there's some sort of spiritual reality that's in conflict with the physical reality, and the spiritual reality is truer.
It is actually in a way that they actually kind of have an argument, because it's always true. Definition, if one definition follows on from another definition, therefore 2 + 2 = 4 in every possible universe. So it is perfect. It is the mind of God, because it's eternal. There's never going to be a time and a place where 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. And so they are kind of right about that, but it's also crazy because we are squidgy biological beings. So.
Yeah, exactly, and it's an impulse which has been present in Protestant Christianity for the past 500 years to continue to abstract it out further and further and further.
Yes, I agree.
And progressivism is just kind of a logical endpoint of that.
I assume that there's probably some biological or psychological reason that they could say, well, yes, if you have these character traits, then you are most likely going to be someone who abstracts and believes that the world is essentially fallen. It's like a fallen world because they've got a perfect ideal and it doesn't fit into it, regardless of what that ideal looks like. But approaching politics in that way, I think there's probably always going to be a certain percentage of the population that just think that way.
Yeah, and I think the connection to religion is a very astute point by Moldbug. We do have to be careful with. It's something for Christians to take on board, the fact that modern progressivism is in fact descended from an offshoot of Christianity, and this must be dealt with very careful in religious practice. And for me, the main way out of this is the kingdom of God is in heaven, and we aren't to construct the kingdom of God here on earth. That is not the correct impulse for a Christian, because this is not actually possible. The kingdom of God is in heaven, not in this world. Yeah. And I think this is the view within the Christian system that prevents you from becoming a progressive.
It is. Yeah, I agree. I think that you've got that exactly right. And I mean, is not the point of this world to be not perfect? Is it not the point of the world to be the test as to whether you go to heaven or to hell?
Right. And God tells us that we will toil and suffer in this world. And to attempt to just eliminate that, I think, is essentially fighting against God himself.
Yeah, that's against God's own will. Yeah.
Yes. And I think this is what Christians need to really take on board to avoid going down this progressive path. Even if we manage to defeat it, we don't want to walk this path again. I think, unfortunately, I see this problem even in the Catholic Church itself. I think Christianity as a whole has very much adopted progressivism as a mindset. And if you talk to pretty much anyone of any Christian religion, they'll often be very annoyed with their pastors. Our mutual friend, academic agent, as you may know, tried to become a Catholic at some point about a year ago, and wasn't very happy with what was being.
Well, I bet it was quite progressive, wasn't it? I mean, I've listened to the Pope.
Yeah, AA said he was talking about refugees and healthcare and stuff too much.
Well, was that when he stopped kissing migrant feet? Was it? Sorry, I actually kind of hate the Pope, and I'm an atheist. He bothers me. It bothers me what he does. It's not very Catholic for the Pope to kiss Muslim feet, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem that we have, right? And it's very troubling.
Like I spiritually, I'd be a Protestant, but I want the Catholics to be Catholic. Like I don't want them to be communist.
Yeah, I think we agree with that as well. And I'm not sure. It's a tough problem for Catholics.
Just to be clear, right? I feel this way about almost every group at this point. Like I'm effectively like a champion of the TERFs now, and the TERFs actually kind of hate me because to them I'm a men's rights advocate, right? And I did a debate against an intersectional feminist, and the comments were the funniest thing in the world. I hate Sargon, but he's absolutely right that gender is biological. There's biological basis for gender. It's like that's because it's objective reality. It's obviously true. And I've been thinking about this a lot because it's just like I don't want them to be destroyed or anything like that. It's the same way that I don't want the Catholics to be destroyed, and so essentially, anyone who isn't that thing that's being attacked by progressives kind of has an obligation to try and buttress the thing using their own using the definitions that it uses to define itself into existence as an idea, as a concept, before it can even become a physical institution. So I mean, I'm going to translate this probably into at some point like a live show in Scotland, and I'm basically going to get the Scottish audience cheering for the existence of the English,
as they ought to.
No, that's the point, right? If the English go away, then who are the Scots going to blame for all their problems? Who are the Scots going to complain about on a daily basis? And so the very nature of being adversarial requires there to be in England, and at the rate things are going, there might not always be in England. So maybe the Scots need to speak up and say, hang on a second, we're still 96% Scottish. So why is England now only like 70% English or whatever it is, whatever it's going to be in the next census, 80% or whatever it is, and that puts them outside of the identity group themselves, the oppressors. And so they are in the position where they can actually ask that question without being shut down as being called bigots or something like that, and I think that is actually something that's the reason that I do this for the TERFs, and what I do, why I'm here talking to like people like you guys is like I don't think everyone has to go away because they can be defined out of existence. I think it's terrible.
So to get back towards Moldbug a bit here.
Sorry, yeah, we're wandering a bit, aren't we?
Oh yeah, no problem. So I reread the open letter in preparation for the stream. It's quite long. I mean, it's like a 300-page book, and I took a lot of notes, and I wrote down some interesting ideas that popped out to me that I hadn't realized before. So one of the interesting ideas, and I think you both will probably see the relevance to what's happening right now, particularly in the United States, is that Moldbug points out that the cause of revolutions is not actually oppression, but weak government, which I thought was a very interesting point.
I wouldn't frame it that way. The causes are those that what we could just summarize as oppression, but I would say that weak government is a facilitator of revolution.
I think that's a fair correction, let's say, on that point. And I think we, in terms of us wanting some sort of, I don't like the word revolution, but let's say regime change that ceases to oppress us, right?
Cathedral change, yeah.
Yeah, a cathedral change. It's certainly not weak in terms of oppressing us, right? So we are being oppressed, and yet we cannot seem to change the cathedral. It is because it is strong that revolution is not possible. And he starts tying this in.
Let me think about that, because there are lots of factors now that affect things in ways that are unprecedented, right? Like, if like the reason they've got their change is because they took to the streets, and we're not taking to the regular person is not taking to the streets. If you were to be able to get millions of people out in the street, then that's the raw demonstration of power. It's all done virtually now, even down to the ballot box. And so people do feel like they're steering their countries in the right direction.
Well, I don't think that's I don't think that's quite accurate, because the reason why the leftist protesting is able to get leftist results is because people in all the positions of power in the cathedral are leftist. There are massive right-wing protests, not infrequently in the United States. Probably the largest annual protest is the Right to Life protest,
Right, okay.
And it barely accomplishes anything. It barely even gets news coverage. Even in Canada,
I didn't know about it.
Yeah, it's yeah.
This is the
Even in
first I
Canada,
learned about it.
Yeah, even in Canada, the largest, one of the largest protests I know in my city is the Right to Life one, and the the pro-life movement is much less advanced here. So I mean, anyway, to connect it to street violence.
I think you're right. I think I was downplaying the power of the cathedral there. I think you're right.
Yeah. But something like it's something like street violence that we see. Left wingers get away with it because left wingers have friends in high places and right wingers don't. And that's something we've seen in many countries. In Weimar Germany, people that had connections could get away with street violence, and people that didn't. So yeah, I think that's kind of the deciding factor.
Well, that's kind of that's where Moldbug actually took this point. He actually looked at Weimar Germany, but I think this also applies to what we're seeing now with Seattle and whatnot. And if you examine historical insurgencies, it seems that insurgency is only really possible when the government supports it to some extent. And Moldbug actually describes insurgency itself as a sort of guerrilla theater that's adjacent to politics. And the insurgents actually serve the interests of politicians, and the politicians in turn serve the interests of insurgents, and they kind of work in this hand-to-hand method. And I think you see this dynamic happening right now in the United States with these, with what happened in Chaz, but also the riots generally. Like, the insurgents are only able to do what they do because the government allows
the permissiveness of the state.
Yeah, and not only that, but it serves the interests of the state. And one of the problems we have here that Moldbug has talked about recently in his Clear Pill essays is we sort of have this problem of mass participation in politics. And I think you described the protesters or whatever getting their way. I would say the protesters aren't really getting their way. They're kind of just this mechanism in the machine that works, because they don't really have any power themselves. Like, they're just a theatrical element that is allowed to play out, that the cathedral then uses as a means to promote what it wants to do. And you can see this, like, the right-wing protests have no power, right? You didn't even know about them. You knew about the left-wing ones because you were shown the theater. But in reality, these people, I actually know people who go to these protests, and I wonder, what do you think you're doing when you go to this protest? Like, what is your actual goal? How is what you're doing right now actually moving you closer to the levers of power, basically? Because that's basically what you're trying to do when you participate in politics. But when you actually look at the dynamics at play, the protests are really just a sort of tool of the cathedral and not actually in any way useful to the people participating in them, because they have different goals than the cathedral.
I mean, I would assume that the purpose of the protest is to theoretically put pressure on the politicians and other establishments through raising public awareness that there's a great well of concern about a certain issue. But you're right. If those institutions are all controlled by an antithetical or antipathetical ideology, then they're just going to do what they can to shut you down.
Right. Or, sort of throw you a bone here or there, but maybe go way beyond. Like, some of the people I know who participate in protests is like they have this vague concept of like, justice and policing or something in terms of, police violence or whatever. But the cathedral doesn't care, right? It doesn't really care what the individual protests want or the protests as a whole. It's just this tool that it uses. And so the problem here is the way this ties into how Moldbug is currently framing how to defeat the system, which he frames as the clear pill, which is actually to just stop participating in it. Cease political activity, cease voting, cease all of the actions that actually justify the cathedral, because what justifies it is this illusion of democratic choice that we really can, in this sort of mass democratic fashion, through the ballot box, through demonstrations, truly influence the cathedral, when in reality, the government basically just does whatever it wants, within a certain extent, right? It doesn't actually have to be affected by these apparent mechanisms. So
just to interrupt there, I think that we should refrain from saying things like the government, because the closer I've gotten to political establishments, the more I've realized that the politicians themselves are not very bright. They're not well read, and the ones that are well read get stigmatized for being well read. And they're very afraid of the idea of public perception because they're entirely reliant on votes. So they're often, I mean, they're easily whipped by the cathedral into doing what they're told either way. And generally they don't have too much of a plan. And the ones that do have a plan come off as unhinged lunatics, like Jeremy Corbyn, and Bernie Sanders. It's not that the government just does what it wants; it does what it feels like it's incentivized to do, and that's the purpose of protest. They're supposed to make them feel incentivized to do something. I mean, like for example, the Conservative government with the free speech rallies we did in probably 2018, I think it was, with Tommy Robinson, and there were loads of us. We had something like 10 to 20,000 people turn up outside of Westminster, which for a protest that's not being staged by, and it's being demonized entirely by the cathedral, that should have put a shot across their bow. Say, look, where the real power lies in a democratic system. But for some reason they're just weak, and so I don't think just saying the government, it's too full of individuals who are not the best and brightest.
That's a good point. I would say that's a mistake on my part to abuse that word.
I understand why you would just say the government, because it's a convenient way of talking about that mechanism, right?
Well, this is interesting because the government is actually influenced by these politics, because politics affect politicians, and politicians are incentivized to do certain things. But the trick being played here is that the government is more or less the PR arm or public face of the sort of real power, the cathedral or the deep state, or whatever you want to call it. And that's why disengagement from mass politics in terms of everyone participating so actively in politics, right? Everyone's so energized. This is what validates the current system we have, because it's validating this public false face that it displays to us. And so the only way to actually get through that, at least as Moldbug seems to frame it, is to actually cease accepting the government as the face of power in of itself. And the way you do that is to not engage with the mechanisms it uses to legitimize itself, which we would call democracy.
The problem is, you're right that the government is a corporation, but it's a unique corporation. It has a unique status that no other corporation can have, and it is, in a way, totalizing. There is no person who is not subject to the law. And if you want to see good laws written, ceding the field of lawmaking to the people who will make bad laws is just bad tactics, in my opinion. But it would, I suppose, accelerate a revolution.
Yeah, well, this is kind of the problem, right? So I think Moldbug is probably right, but at the same time, I want to vote for Trump to buy more time with the right wing. So, I'm not. These are all fairly fresh ideas that he's putting out right now, and I'm not really sure.
I'm not saying that he's wrong. That's the thing, because what I've done is appeal to the contingent, appeal to something empirical. But he, in principle, he is right. I mean, it would be better to do that, and that would be a healthy way to deal with it. Just disengage. But I do think that the consequences of that could be worse than like getting involved in politics and being political. And I mean, it genuinely scares me. That's the problem. I mean, was it Judge Jeanine Pirro or something said, the silent majority doesn't really mean anything because they don't get involved. It's the radicals that make the decisions and drive the agenda. And she's right. And so we've got to be the radicals for the positions that we think are best for us. And I think that ceding the field, like I said, it is a battle. It's a culture war. And if we just let them take the objectives, then we're going to lose.
Yeah. So let me reframe this concept, because I've been kind of struggling with this clear pill concept that Moldbug has put out. I think the problem he sees, and I think he's right on this, is that a lot of the problems we have now is there's just sort of there's too many people just causing chaos, just taking action and having no idea what they're doing, right? Just going to these protests, and they're just sort of blindly participating and just pouring energy into the system.
Should we just call them useful idiots?
Yeah, basically. There's just too many useful idiots. And that I think what Moldbug is trying to do is to get us to return to a healthier type of society where you don't have this mass participation in politics day to day, constantly coming from so many parts of the population, because they're really just feeding into the amount of energy into the system, which is adding to the chaos. So I think what he wants is for most people who really shouldn't be interested in politics. I mean, it's kind of silly how much we have to be interested in politics, right? And that's kind of one of Moldbug's problems, is that there's so much brain space just wasted on this problem in the population right now. And
or worse, there's too little brain space used for people who still vote. That's actually, I can see that as being a real concern. Sorry, carry on.
Right. Well, so I think the way I conceive of the problem is not that we should stop fighting or anything like that. But I think what he's saying is that most people are just kind of messing around and don't really know what they're doing. And if you're actually going to participate in politics, you really need to know what you're up against, what you're trying to achieve specifically, have a plan, right? Like you have a specific plan that you're aiming for in what you're doing. Like you have short and midterm goals, maybe regarding your media organization. You're not just sort of, flailing about in the political battle, just causing problems for people that aren't actually aimed at anything. And I think that's the problem Moldbug is identifying, that we need people to, he says his mission is a mission of chill. And I think that's actually a very good phrasing. If we could just get people to chill and leave the politics to the people who are, maybe legitimately interested in this sort of thing, like us, we're political junkies, right?
Yeah.
We would have, things would just automatically get better, because so much of this chaos would just recede and everything would just, in some sense go back to normal, sort of the pre-Trump era.
I mean, it would definitely be beneficial to have the low information voters just stop voting. Because I honestly think that that's the primary reason that the Labour Party gets anywhere. Sort of low information tribal voters. I wouldn't object to some kind of political course that everyone has to pass before they are allowed to vote. I honestly, it doesn't have to be very complicated. You can do it at school, like GCSE or A level or whatever, qualifications you guys have there in politics, and everyone does it because obviously you're all going to be voters and you have to achieve a passing grade on this course. So you have to have at least some basic understanding of what politics is before you can start engaging in it, I don't think that's unreasonable.
Yeah, well, this sort of leads into the why do we even bother with this democracy thing at all problem, right? That's sort of how he's basically getting to that point. And maybe what you're describing there could alternatively be called an aristocratic republic or something like that. So you could have voting in the sense that it was restricted, maybe in how the Romans did it or something like that.
Well, I would probably just have it as an aptitude test, some whatever standardized aptitude test that everyone has to take or something like that. I wouldn't have anything too extreme or anything like that. I would make sure that anyone could go and do it if they wanted to. I'd still want high voter population participation, but I'd like people to know something about what they were talking about, even if it's just the history of the prominent political parties at the time or whatever it is. But sorry, anyway.
One of the interesting things I've noticed, just as my channel grows and I start participating more in the community and stuff, politics is really, really complicated and takes a lot of work, and you have no idea how much you don't know about. Right, and I'm sure.
And the more you learn, the more you realize how much there is you don't know as well.
Exactly, and so I'm starting to get some of this perspective, and I'm looking at just sort of all of the people I know just always talking about politics and doing things like going to protests, and I'm just looking at them. I'm like, why are you even bothering with this? You're just wasting your time. There's no reason for you to do this because you're not doing anything. In fact, you're actually serving the system that you hate by energizing it with the protest, right? But they don't even.
It's a muck revolution, man. What are you talking about?
Right, exactly.
Corporate backing.
So, I think this is where Moldbug currently is in terms of what he's writing now, and I think it is interesting stuff, and it is important because this is, I would say, somewhat anti-enlightenment in how it's phrased, right? Because we derive this concept of universal suffrage from the Enlightenment in some sense. So it is very counter-enlightenment. Let's not say anti-enlightenment necessarily.
Yeah. I would find myself coming into a kind of universal opportunity for suffrage. I think is not just like a more politically correct way of saying it, but like a more I don't know how to frame it, because if you say, right, we're going to restrict suffrage to an arbitrary group of people who are landed aristocracy or something like that, that's very arbitrary and very unfair to people who would like to participate enough and find themselves by accident of birth locked out of it. And I think that to the Enlightenment mind is the travesty. The Enlightenment is essentially the attempt to gain the absolute freedom of the will, whether it realized it or not when it began. That's what essentially contained the seeds of, and they germinate. And so freedom of the will, to an extent, is important, and I think the opportunity has to be there to exercise that freedom, or liberty, should we say, if the opportunity is if the desire is there. But for most people, the desire just isn't there. So, why would they bother?
One of the problems I've noticed, and this is just with the language itself, is I've noticed that equality of opportunity is often, you know what I'm getting at already. It's sort of a sly way of slipping in equality of outcome every single time.
Yeah. I shouldn't have used it, but in my defense, I think we could use it for something that is abstract, like a test. You've got the opportunity to pass a test just as much as anyone else does. It doesn't require you to have a certain amount of money or anything.
I mean, the term equality is very ancient, of course. I mean, as both of us are Catholic, and Thomas Aquinas used it, but I think it's so corrupted in the modern lexicon that I can't imagine using it in a positive way. I don't think taking it back currently is even really an option. I try to avoid the phrase entirely.
Unironically, though, I don't think abandoning it is an option either. That's
I just try to use different words to describe a similar concept.
Totally agree with you, though. The concept of equality has been so thoroughly bastardized by so many different types of Enlightenment politics, incidentally, that it's. I do try to avoid it. I've got to say, I do try to avoid using it because, as a goal, absolute equality is a horrible idea. Just equally left alone is what I'd be aiming for.
There's another. This is, I guess, a pattern in Moldbug is sort of identifying changes in the way language is used. Like the concept of government itself, and this sort of ties into equality, is, the modern conception of government is that government is a charitable institution, basically, and it does good works. And that's not really the purpose of government.
No.
The purpose of the government is basically to secure order for a society, and that's basically the long and short of it. I would say it's not a charity, but people have this view of it being a charity, and this sort of ties into one of the ways that the cathedral sustains itself as well. Is it creates dependence on itself. It's a very perverse phenomenon, actually. Like there are millions and millions of people in our countries now who are utterly dependent on the cathedral for their very existence, and this is one of the perverse ways it actually secures itself. It's sort of it's abusive. It's abusive in its relations to the general public.
Yep. I agree. I think that the welfare state, as nobly intentioned as it may well have been, the consequences of it can't be ignored. They're played out on the streets every day. They're terrible. We have to, I'm not saying abandon it, but some kind of reanalysis has to occur. It just can't go on like this. Otherwise, Heinlein will have been proven right. There will be some absolute collapse of society and the military will end up taking over.
Another problem we have in the modern conception of government is it sort of claims to be, but it's not based on ethics or any consistent ethical system whatsoever. It's just based on public opinion, right? This is sort of one of the funny things about our Supreme Court in the U.S. in its reinterpretations of the Constitution into what we have, we call it the living Constitution, and we seem to have this weird idea as if we could derive all of these certain rights directly from it, but that's not really the case at all. What's happening with changes in the interpretation of the law, like take the Second Amendment, is that there are changes in public opinion, not changes in ethics, because the government is.
I'm not sure you can say they're different. I think the ethics will drive what drives public opinion.
I suppose you could say it's a change in the ethics of the public, but not a change in the ethics that the government is allegedly based on, right? Like the U.S. government is supposed to be based on certain ethical principles, and if it actually were, we would have a stable government system. But in fact, it simply adapts itself to public opinion through what Moldbug calls manufacturing consent. Which is pretty interesting.
Pretty Noam Chomsky-ish.
Yeah, I think he actually might cite Chomsky.
I wouldn't be surprised. Chomsky's not wrong when he said on the idea of manufacturing consent. He's wrong on the what would be good, but he's not wrong on his observation that the sort of media industrial complex that does it. It does.
Well, that's actually really funny because Chomsky's solution is to just give the cathedral even more power. His solution is that the problem is that there's these evil corporations controlling consent, so we need to give it all the power to the media, so they can objectively tell us the truth.
Yeah. But the thing is, right? We laugh, but there is no answer to the question. That's the thing. I don't think there's a single good answer, or even a half decent answer.
Yeah, well, you do have to respect some of these leftists, at least in some of their ideas. Like, Moldbug references Alinsky a few times, and Alinsky really understood the dynamics of politics. What he understood is that what you're seeking fundamentally above all is power, because that's the only way you can actually implement anything you want. You're not, you want to do certain things in government, but you're not seeking that per se. What you're seeking is the power to implement it. And this is what's really driving the left. And I think the right wing does, to some extent, carefully have to recognize this, that we are seeking power. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like power Power must always be used carefully.
The problem, people get nervous when you start talking about power because it sounds like Genghis Khan, but power is just our ability to mold and shape the world according to our will. This is necessary. This is how we have anything we have. The problem with power is when it's unaccountable. And this is why I think a lot of people would be very, very reticent to abandon the what I'm just going to call the sort of English liberal, classical liberal power dynamics. The balance of power in a classically liberal society is actually really quite good. It's actually more in favor of the general person than the state and anything else, than previous or alternative solutions. So that it's not that there's anything wrong with power. It's just that if your power looks like it's going to be unaccountable, then it becomes dangerous and scary, right?
So you mentioned classical liberal there. This actually reminds me of something else Moldbug talks about is, he makes the observation that some of the classical liberals who made concessions to a constitutional monarchy, right? Like one of the things they were trying to prevent was the French Revolution, right? Basically what was happening on the continent at the time. And they basically had this conception that by making small concessions to the left, essentially, for lack of a better term, they would actually preserve the monarchy and they wouldn't fall as France and the rest of the continent did. And it turns out that doesn't seem to exactly be true, which I find
that's how Britain avoided revolution itself.
Well, they did avoid the revolution, but they didn't keep their monarchy, right?
Who?
Britain. You still have a monarch, right? But it's a pale imitation of what the monarch previously used to do.
It is after the English Civil War, it was firmly established that Parliament was sovereign, and so the formal structures of the country were all in place, and it all hinged on the idea of there being a king. That's why they keep returning a king after Oliver Cromwell. We still need the king to be the king because it all is predicated on an oath of loyalty to the king. But the power is very firmly in the hands of Parliament. But that's not the same as the French Revolution, in my opinion.
Oh no, it's not the same as the French Revolution in terms of what happened specifically, but at the end outcome, Britain and France are more or less in the same position at this point in terms of their form of government. And I just think that's an interesting historical observation more than anything, that many of the people who were willing to make these constitutional monarchy concessions sort of had this idea that it would ultimately preserve the monarchy as it was. But in fact, it sort of, this ties into, again, why Moldbug takes the reactionary position, because his view is that what he calls the Whig force, the W force, the only way to oppose it is to actually oppose it, and which means making zero concessions to it, essentially. And it doesn't. You can observe this even if you're still very liberal yourself. You can observe that you don't ever win by making concessions to the left. They always just, there's this force in history that seems to.
So I wouldn't agree with your characterization of the non-aristocratic factions, say in pre-revolutionary France, as being the left. I don't think that's fair, because a lot of these people were commoners, as in the estate, the feudal estates. I don't think analogizes well to post-enlightenment politics. So I would say that the commoners, the starving peasants, they're not the left.
No, I wouldn't say that either.
And so it's not like what they were crying out over was a form of oppression, and understandably so. Making concessions to those people is eminently sensible and not revolutionary. You will not end up losing the monarchy through those concessions, because their objection is not fundamentally with the existence of the monarchy. Their objection is with the current deprivation that they're living in. However, with the ideological, as in the communists, the revolutionaries, anyone who creates a cult of reason or something like that, that is an irreconcilable position with the monarchy. The monarchy has to go. The church has to go. It all has to go. The world has to change. And that, I think, is what Moldbug is speaking to when he says you can't make concessions to it. Because why would you make concessions to the crocodile? Okay, you can eat my foot. It's like, no, you're not going to eat any of me. Like that would be the response. In fact, I'm going to do my best to slay this dragon that's trying to eat me rather than just feeding it my arm. I agree with. But you can't say you can't concede any demands that are going to say weaken the absolute strength of the monarchy. That creates the pretext for their revolution to get rid of the monarchy. That creates the grounds for it to breed the revolution.
Well, yeah, that's a good point to make. But to be more exact, what Moldbug said is that you can't concede to the cathedral. Right. Not that you can't deal with various groups that have different concerns.
Yeah, but I think when we say the cathedral, if we specifically mean progressives, then yes, because they eventually want to abolish society. But each civilization has its own cathedral, and not all cathedrals are revolutionary. So I think I just want to be specific, basically. But if we're talking progressives, absolutely, they're communist revolutionaries and they want to destroy everything.
Yeah, and that's certainly not to say that the French didn't have any legitimate grievances during that period, because certainly the monarchy did fail its people, and that is why the revolution happened. And I think Moldbug would frame this as weak government, and not in the sense that the government didn't have power, but it didn't do its duty, basically. When the government doesn't do its duty to the citizens, this is how revolutions happen. And I think that's what he fundamentally means from what I mentioned earlier, that the cause of revolution isn't oppression as such, but more so the result of the government not performing its proper role in society.
Yeah. I think that's fair.
So you mentioned the cult of reason in France, right? And there's one very funny thing. I think Moldbug's a very comical writer, which is one of the reasons I enjoy his work. But he makes this really funny observation regarding the progressive religion in the United States, right? So if you're familiar with our First Amendment, you'll understand that yes, well, Congress shall make no laws regarding the establishment of a religion, right? And if you regard what the cathedral is propagating as a religion, then it's essentially a criminal conspiracy against the government of the United States, right, within Congress itself. And I think that's a very, it's kind of a cute observation, but I think it's also very correct in noting that we are living fundamentally against what our original set of rights were supposed to be.
I was going to say this at the beginning of the conversation, but it didn't come up. A good entry for it didn't come up. But yeah, I agree that we could argue from a secular point of view. We demand freedom from that religion, as our constitutional rights.
Now, I would say this argument, it's an interesting observation, but it wouldn't be effective against the cathedral, obviously, because it doesn't care.
I don't know, actually. I think that there are parts of the cathedral that are susceptible to this. So the cathedral is not monolithic. It's made up of different parts that are all working in concert. But many of these are not actually the same. They just have the same interests, and they're united under the same banners. But I do think that there are parts of the cathedral that would be susceptible to that. And I think those parts might actually stem from progressive Islamic activists like Ilhan Omar.
I think another part that could potentially be vulnerable in this way are, conservatives themselves who care about the Constitution to some degree.
Yeah.
Because, the cathedral does adopt them as part of itself. And this is part of its mechanism. And you could this would be very difficult, but you could potentially break certain conservatives off from it if you actually made this case to them. It is sort of a long-winded case to make, but I thought that was one, that's one interesting observation that Moldbug makes that could actually be useful when talking to conservatives who care about the Constitution. If you can actually make them see that, because people forget about what's in the First Amendment. They think about free speech, and they sort of forget the freedom of religion part. But if you actually point out that we are living in a sort of theocracy at the moment, and that this is literally illegal,
I think from a constitutionalist perspective, that is a strong argument, especially when all you would need to do is get the constitutionalists to define the aspects of a religion, what qualifies as a religion, and they would give belief structure, mantras, rituals, etc., and we can point to all of these.
This sort of ties into another, not necessarily First Amendment argument, but First Amendment point in the U.S. So we understand what a state-controlled press is, right? You can look at that historically.
Yeah. BBC.
What does a press-controlled state look like?
Well, that's what we've got now.
Yes, that's very interesting because we have this concept of freedom of the press. But we certainly don't have freedom from the press, right?
No, the Fourth Estate has realized. No, this is another great point. The Fourth Estate is definitely unionized. The way you can tell is, and this was something I noticed way back in Gamergate. Again, like people laugh at the idea of Gamergate now, but I tell you, it was a great training ground for what's happening now. It was just a microcosm of what's happening now, and everyone thought that there was a conspiracy going on because, say, on the same day, like 10 or 12 articles that all have exactly the same narrative and exactly the same, phraseology and purpose, all come out like on the same day and one after another. And everyone's like, my God, but that was the Cathedral, right? That didn't require a conspiracy. That was one person seeing one of their peers having said something, going like, that's true. That's a true moral legislation. These types of people are evil, and therefore I should say that to prove my allegiance, to demonstrate, as an act of faith, and they all do it. And so you don't need coercive control. It's done willingly.
Yeah, and I do definitely agree with you on the importance of Gamergate here. I mean, I wouldn't have a channel doing what I'm doing if it wasn't for Gamergate, because I, like you, was just playing my video games.
Yeah, right.
I just wanted to play video games,
Why did you make me do this?
And I saw what was happening. I started watching your channel.
Yeah.
And I'm like, hey, I could get into this, and now I'm a reactionary edgy boy. But yeah, no, Gamergate is really important to what's happening. And that was, I think that was a point at which the Cathedral overstepped. And you're seeing this happen more and more. I'm not sure why it's happening. Settler, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, what's going on with the Cathedral sort of stepping out into view in ways that it wouldn't normally do?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like it's just kind of all going into overdrive. Things that would have taken, like, we got gay marriage not that long ago. And now, now we're getting the trans stuff, and it's like these are changes that, like, previously would have taken a few decades, maybe. But
I think I can explain it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think what we've seen in the last, I'd say probably leading up to the election of Donald Trump, they were very much incrementalists, because there was nothing serious that was in opposition to them. No one was taking a separate moral origin to themselves. Everyone kind of fundamentally agreed that, we're the ones who get to decide what we think is right and wrong, and we don't defer this power, and so we end up in the kind of default Kantian moral legislator framework, which I think does have value. That's the thing. That's the reason it works and it has strength and it allows this to carry on, is because it does have strength, and it's empowering. And so there's no one else with a separate moral origin that's arguing against them. So essentially, they're eventually going to win every argument because there's not really a lot you can say. They're like, well, we just think people should be free to transition their genders. Well, if freedom is literally the ultimate goal of Enlightenment politics, then they win. They've it's like, who's willing to bet the most? I'm not all in, and everyone's like, well, okay, I'm gonna have to show my cards then, because I can't up the ante any further than ultimate freedom from even being a biological organism. So it's like, okay. But the thing is, Donald Trump isn't really doing that. He's actually appealing to like tradition, and it's this opposite moral or separate moral origin that is, I think, what they're so afraid of and why they think Trump is essentially the new Hitler. But if you look at the institutions, like Trump's little renegade gang have come in, that's great. And they've squatted like in a castle, but everything else is still controlled by the cathedral. So essentially Trump is under siege for taking this castle by the forces of the cathedral. And they've realized that outside of the castle, there's no one that can stop them. Not one business owner is going to stand up and say, no, I disagree with Black Lives Matter. Not one company, not one activist. And the people who would make those principled moral arguments from a separate moral origin to their own get deplatformed. So they don't even get to speak. So they've realized that they've got full control over the sort of social fabric of the country and are just pushing full on forward. And they really are going into overdrive.
So I think this actually ties into a concept Moldbug's written about recently in his concept of the 1 versus 2 story state. And basically he proposes, you can have a 1-story state, which we all understand what that is. It's essentially a totalitarian state in terms of what you're allowed to think. What we live in is the 2-story state. The 2-story state is interesting because you have 2 different stories. In our case, liberalism and conservatism, let's say, just to use the American terms. Yeah. And, there's sort of between them, and it's a stable dynamic between these 2 controlled stories that more or less exist in the Overton bubble. And Moldbug uses this weird analogy regarding like an engine or something, but basically this is a system that works. It makes people feel like they're they have free thought and they're not existing within some sort of controlled thought paradigm, when in fact in some sense they actually are. And what Trump is doing, and Moldbug brings this up, is that the one thing that is really a danger to the 2-story state are third stories, and particularly third stories that are true and appeal to rogue elites and exalt the middle class, basically. And I think we're seeing all of those things happen right now in many countries, in particular in the United States. So I think the cathedral has noticed this third story that it needs to crush, and that's basically what you've observed right here. Yeah. And that's why it's lashing out, because essentially if the third story is allowed to exist, the system stops functioning as this finely tuned engine, and it starts to break down. And the way Moldbug poses the outcome of this is, basically the 2-story state could become a 1-story state, which I think is the direction we're headed in, right?
When they're both telling essentially the same story, what's the difference?
Right.
That I would use Labour and Conservatives. The Conservative Party in this country is essentially carrying out the Labour agenda.
Yes.
So it's no particular difference.
Yeah. So
different coats of paint.
Yeah, and just no, like, less and less dissent is even being allowed. I mean, despite like even just all the things they force on us through the institutions that they control, even worse than that, they're not even allowing us to object anymore with the bannings we've seen all over social media. And it does seem like we'll get to a point not in the incredibly distant future where barely any objection at all is permitted.
The Overton window is narrowing, isn't it? Everyone talks about it moving, but we don't talk about expanding.
Yeah,
and it should be expanding. So, the way I envisage the best case scenario for the regular person is very much like the way Hayek envisions it. Actually, there's a bit in the Red Serfdom where he's like, look, the problem isn't propaganda, right? Everyone produces propaganda for everything all the time. The problem, say, in a totalitarian state with propaganda is all the propaganda is going in one direction. so you only hear one side of the story. The ideal, what would be optimal in a liberal state, I guess we'll call it, is that you've got propaganda coming from all different directions and going in all different directions, and so you're exposed to a very wide range of things, so you don't become radicalized to any one point of view. And I think that's very much what we're seeing on social media now. It feels quite prescient. It must be a repeat of the same forces that were happening in his day, because Twitter seems to be emulating that completely. Social media putting everyone into these radical echo chambers. It's wild.
Yeah, and the merger of the two stories into one is an interesting process, because it's not even a top-down process, is it? It's sort of just happening in its own organic sense. And the analogy Moldbug uses specifically was the two-stroke versus four-stroke engine, if I remember correctly. And the system is designed to operate as a two-stroke engine. Let's say when you try to operate the engine a different way as a one-story state, it does not function.
Yeah.
And either what's going to happen, in his view, is essentially one-story totalitarianism, which seems to be what the Cathedral's trying to do. Particularly in Britain. I mean, Britain is really scary right now, scary place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or a third story emerges. And this is also dangerous territory, right? Because there are many third stories, and not all of them are agreeable to us necessarily. I mean, you have the fascist story, of course, the libertarian story, many different possibilities out there.
Yeah.
And this is a really dangerous area to go in, but it seems to be where we're inevitably headed. So I think what I'm trying to do is, and I think in some sense what we're all trying to do, is to try and find a third story that can work for the West, because it's pretty clear that the two-story system isn't working. We do need some sort of third story, and the one-story condition is going to be intolerable for people like us, because we are at odds with what that one story is turning out to be.
Yeah. I agree. That's like I was saying earlier. I think there does need to be some kind of synthesis, essentially synthesizing the Enlightenment into tradition. I think is because tradition, I think, is like going from the English perspective. And I've been studying this quite a lot. That you can see a lot of the same desires for the liberal state we ended up with in, say, medieval ballads about King Arthur, right, and Robin Hood and things like this. So a lot of the same themes are present, because they're obviously speaking to realities of people's lives at the time, and it's not too surprising that it turned out the way it does. But we have to be able to channel it effectively away from the revolutionary fervor, away from the looking at the world in an a priori fashion and saying, well, it shouldn't be like this at all. It should be in this way that I've just made up. It's like, why should it be that way? That's actually, if it should be that way, why isn't it that way? It's you've got to answer all these other questions that essentially make you end up saying something like, well, the world was created by an evil god, by the demiurge, and the true enlightened God is somewhere beyond the realm, beyond the veil. It's like, yeah, sure it is. So we need to get away from defining the world as should be perfect, as should have been perfect, and incorporate the good parts of the Enlightenment into our traditions. That's what I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. And synthesis is a word I actually use, and is something I'm looking for as well.
Yeah.
From a variety of sources. Christian, hardcore traditional, like Julius Evola, for example. Libertarianism. I do value the concept of liberty. Sure. I also value order. And living in a good moral society, and this is really our challenge. Is there's no way to just this is the problem I have with, I guess, some like hardcore traditionalists maybe is there's no totalizing worldview from the past that we can simply adopt. That we have to contend with the fact that we do live in a post-Enlightenment, postmodern era, and we can't turn away from that. We have no choice but to synthesize older traditions with what we have now in a way that's going to produce a positive outcome, which is not the one the progressives are aiming at. And so this is the difficult problem we face, and really I think the crux of what we're doing right now is trying to figure out what that synthesis is.
I think you're bang on the money. I I I hate having to constantly discuss 20th century ideologies, like
Yes.
fascism, communism. It's like they both are tremendous failures. They didn't produce good world, did they? They produced a horrible, horrible world. Like the most human suffering that has ever happened in all of human history happened in the 20th century. Like that's a big enough repudiation, I would think, to anyone who's just got a grain of sense in their heads. Just what were they saying that was true, and then let's move forward. Yeah, we need order. Equality. Dare I use the term? But some idea of. I think when people say equality, I don't think they really mean equality either. I think they just mean a sense of inclusion and agency, right? They feel that if we're all the same in some way, then we've all got the same kind of agency when it comes to politics. I don't think they actually think that we should all be the same in everything or anything like that. So I agree with the getting away from the word equality if possible. But there are concerns, there are moral arguments, there are moral claims that come from these things, and so I really do think that we have to incorporate those going forward. That's why I've essentially found myself in a position of being like a liberal nationalist. I don't want to persecute people by race, and not because. And not just because that would be morally wrong, in my opinion, obviously. There are lots of practical reasons, and there's the mindset and the worldview and the teleology of it that I think is just wrong. That's not me living my best life. You know what I mean? Self-actualizing. I don't think that's other people self-actualizing either. Aside from the demonstrable evils that will occur. So I don't want to go down the idea of a racial nationalist, but I am definitely a sort of civic patriot. I do like my country. And I think that the government's responsibility is to preserve it intact for my son, and then his son and his son after that. So naturally, I find myself with an aversion to things like mass immigration or revolutionary politics and stuff like this, and that just seems to be the most moral way forward for me that I can see at the moment.
Yeah, the ethnic nationalist versus civic nationalist, I guess, problem is an interesting one. I mean, I would definitely fall more on the ethnic side, but I mean, my problem with that as like a holistic ideology is that, there are obviously millions and billions and millions of white people in the United States that I don't want to live in the same country as, basically, right? So
millions of progressives who are going to be clogging up your ethno states.
But at the same time, there's obviously an attack on white people from the Cathedral. So yeah, so this problem exists, but simply race in of itself isn't like a holistic.
Yeah.
It's something to integrate into a larger worldview, because ethnicity is real, culture is real. It's tied to a people, to a place, even at a time, and that matters. But if you're just talking about white people in general, that's not sufficient for me, because that's how we got here right now, right? We have the primary force at the moment that is problematic for us is coming in large part, I would say, from white people, right? Like that's just the reality. So if
the Black Lives Matter protest is anything to go by, especially in this country,
exactly.
very much a problem with white people at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, like that video where in America, where the lawyer or whatever with his AR-15 and his wife with the little pistol, it was all white protesters. I looked at the video and like
no, there were a couple of non-white.
Sure.
Let's give them their due. They weren't entirely an ethno-state protest, nearly though. But the thing is, like I think that what we need is not, because the very notion of ethno-states, again, these are abstractions, right? Appealing to race is an abstraction. I'm not saying race isn't, real, or like you are not a thing, obviously. But what I'm saying is the conception of it is an abstraction, and it's the same sort of abstraction that Hitler had. It's like, oh, there should be a greater Germany where all Germans should be under the same Reich. It's like, why should they be? What if these ones don't want it? You've now declared abstractly that you have that, what should happen for, say, a bunch of people who might completely disagree with you. And so And not only that, then what do you do with all the non-Germans who are living in Germany, right? I don't think it's wrong for non-English people to live in England and things like this. But the way I've been looking at it is, I guess, more of a kind of Scruton-esque view, where I'm looking at it in terms of like realism, like what's really there, what you're really seeing. Like, so the local area is the community, as you say, the communities, local geographic communities, become ethnic groups, and the ethnic group is created by the society knitting itself together. So, like, my neighbor's black, but she's a really nice person. I don't want anything bad to happen to her. I want her to enjoy the same liberties as me. I'm never going to accept a kind of racial apartheid or something like that. That's just off the fucking table. In fact, I'll probably go to war against it, So don't even fucking mention it. It's as bad as saying, let's abolish private property. It's just that, no, again, I will take up arms. So, like, it's just obviously the wrong way to do it. But if you start taking the sort of Scruton-esque view where you're looking at the sort of, I guess we'll call it Shire nationalism, right? So the people living there, they matter, right? The things that they believe matter. The way they live their lives matter, and allowing them to live their lives in peace is essentially the goal I would think of a good government. To get on, enforce contracts, make sure we don't get invaded by the Russians, and just let them live their lives. And so that's not race related at all. So if like there's long been an Afro-Caribbean community in Britain, and nobody wants to get rid of them because for the most part they're really nice. They're just normal people. I swear to God, they're not like American blacks are different to British blacks, and I don't want to get rid of these people. I don't want to stigmatize them. I don't want to treat them in any way badly, because most of them seem to be totally on board with just getting on with their lives. But the problem is that you have the welfare state that has encouraged single motherhood, that has encouraged lack of fathers, which has encouraged unreal and unremitting tribalism in the inner cities, and now it's turned into open warfare between what are essentially ethnic gangs. That can't be allowed to happen, but that's not the same as saying that my black neighbor now has to be kicked out of the country, right? I definitely would never have any truck with what would be considered to be white nationalism by a reasonable person. But I think that a form of localism gets around that by not stigmatizing the race, but it does have an interest in protecting what already exists.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I'm definitely not a white nationalist or anything like that. I mean, I'm med, so I'm not even white. But no, I do think it is important to separate the idea of race from ethnicity, because I do think ethnicity is very important in the sense of like culture, religion, language, those types of things. So I do. Like, I'm not English, but I imagine you would want your black neighbor to consider themselves English first.
Yes.
So I do. I think the big problem with the term civic is that it focuses on abstract values rather than the culture, which I think is much more important.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, I don't have a better term, but this is why I say liberal nationalist rather than a civic nationalist, because civic kind of implies European Union. That we've got a bureaucratic set of rules for human X, and that's not how I like to look at people as human number, ID card number, blah 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 blah, and it could be anyone from anywhere in the world, and it doesn't matter anything about them. It's kind of grim. It's going to create a kind of world that's very, very corporate, and I don't like corporations. I don't like bureaucracy, so I try to avoid the term civic nationalist. Not that it's wrong, but it just has that kind of flavor to it, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think this is one reason why I would say people on the right, or at least in opposition to the cathedral at the moment, should really be pro decentralization, because I think basically everyone can get what they want out of that. I mean, like if you decentralize the current power structure, you can actually build the society you want. Like in the United States, I actually don't see a problem with African Americans having their own state if that's really if there's actually that's something that people want. I wouldn't want to live there. That's their culture, not mine. I don't have a problem with ethnic nationalism per se. It's just, to me, it's not a totalizing ideology. But if that's what you want, then we can actually achieve that. through.
Well, that's the primary. That's one of the primary contentions that Robin DiAngelo has. She believes that the United States is a segregated society because of people's freedom of association and personal preferences. I mean, it's no surprise that people would rather live next to people who they feel that they understand. You know, like they want to be able to speak the language, they want to understand the values, and these sort of preferences correlate to race. I don't think they're generated by race, but they correlate to race. And this is why the progressives all want to live together. You know, they moved to places like Portland in California because they think they're going to be with people who share their values. And I don't think, I mean, like that technically I think is closer to the definition or a working definition of ethnicity, but ethno-nationalism means racial nationalism now. So, you
know. Yeah, I mean, like. If you actually had freedom of association in the United States for real, inevitably you'd end up with these racially separate places.
This is what gentrification is, isn't it?
And it's fine, right? That's fine as long as people are freely choosing to be where they are.
Yep.
And you don't have the case of bake the gay cake or whatever, right? Like that you should just you have that position. But so to get back, I guess to Moldbug more here. Neo reaction is essentially.
Well, I've just noticed that it's gone 10 o'clock.
Oh, okay.
So I think we'll have to wrap it. I did think I was going to stay for an hour, but I was really enjoying the conversation. It's really, really engaging.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, that's all right. Thanks a lot for having me. I'd be happy to do this sort of thing again if you guys want. Like a couple of weeks or something, because I'll undoubtedly go and mull over a bunch of the stuff that we've talked about, and it might be worth having another conversation.
Yeah, sounds great.
Excellent.
Cool. Okay. Sorry to just dramatically jump out.
No. It has been about 2 hours.
Yeah.
Quite long for the stream.
Well, yeah, but it's. I've been trying to get a normal sleeping pattern together, and
I've been working on that for about 2 years.
Right, and because I work from home and I've never had any problem. I've been able to set my own sleeping pattern. I've been going to bed at like ridiculous o'clock in the morning, and so I've been making sure I get up at 8 o'clock every morning now, and so I don't want to go to bed too late, otherwise I'm going to be knackered tomorrow like an old man. But anyway, thanks a lot for having me, guys.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much.
Yeah, take it easy.
Goodbye.
Okay, so I have to go through super chats before we end this. There aren't too many.
Okay.
But thank you everyone very much for watching. I think it was an interesting conversation. But there's a few. So this. Okay, first, I'm sorry guys, but like if you're too rude to Sargon, I'm not going to read your super chats, or I'm going to have to at least censor them. I don't want you guys being rude to my guests, and that's not just for Sargon. Like the basic rules of politeness. Even if this was a communist or something, I wouldn't want you being rude to the guest in the super chats. Okay, first one. I don't know. I don't feel like I can read anything from this first super chat.
I can't see it. I don't know what it is.
Yeah. Okay, I'll go to the second one. Distributist, $5. Godspeed, men. Hopefully this is the beginning of a larger conversation.
Sounds like it might be.
Yeah, hopefully. Average lampoler something. I don't know. I can't pronounce anything well, guys, so just get used to that. And the first one who I couldn't read, at least I can read the name of the guy. Jedi Knight Anything Cringewalker for $5. I've seen you on AA streams, super chatting there.
Okay.
But average something. I find it interesting that Curtis Yarvin called it the. Okay, not finishing that. A Jedi Knight Anything Cringewalker. Would it be wise to equate this age to iconoclasm? I know of experiences like that with the Byzantines, but we never hear about how it was resolved. I know the iconoclasm with the Byzantines was resolved with the Second Council of Nicaea, where they were condemned and called heretics. and then I guess it reemerged 700 years later with the Reformation. I'm not really. I don't know. I mean, I don't think we're going to have a council anytime soon to condemn progressives as heretics from the American government. That'd be pretty based, I guess. Let's see. A Greek name. No way I can read that. To be on for £5 British. To be honest, I'm just glad that this is finally happening. Wow for £2 great British pounds. Nope, can't read that either. It's about half of them probably I can't read. 21st violinist for $2. Reactionary solution, absolutism. Yep. I can't pronounce this name. Colger for €5. Shout out to Ananethesis. How do you pronounce his name? The YouTuber. Yeah. I'll post. Can you post his link in the chat?
Yeah, let me get it. Yeah, he has a really good channel.
Yeah. Ananesis. I'm not going to pronounce that right. He goes through really in depth a lot of the Moldbug stuff, more in depth than my brain can probably handle. But yes. Check out that channel if you want more. Speaking of which, for the Moldbug stuff, in the comments section or in the description, I have I have several stuff to do with Moldbug. So if anyone here is still learning about Moldbugs and wants to read some more, check out the links there. And there's links to some of his works and to some videos talking about him. James Knight for £5 says, talk about Moldbug's idea of America as the real communist country, or how the Enlightenment is perpetual inequity into resentment.
That's probably a topic for a different stream, but I mean, I would say from reading, I mentioned Burnham earlier, and I didn't really get into it, but I mean, if you actually read what happened in the 20s to, let's say, 50s, like the communists basically took over the U.S. government to a pretty significant extent, more or less. Not even Soviet agents. I mean, just literal American communists who really believed in Soviet communism. And Burnham, if you read The Web of Subversion in particular, it's a fairly short book written in the 1950s. He basically describes the proto-cathedral forming in large part due to the way these operatives took over parts of the U.S. government. And like they took off to they infiltrated USG to the extent that FDR was advised at Yalta by one of these communists, right? So these are top people in the U.S. government as far back as the 50s. I would say the communists, the left has basically won to such a high degree so long ago that they've actually forgotten that they achieved total victory already, which is the only reason why we aren't just totally crushed.
Yeah. What book is it from Burnham?
The Web of Subversion.
Okay.
Very short.
I'll have to check that out. For Narco Republican says for $5 American. How about a Hitlerian republics instead of neo-monarchies? Service guarantees citizenship versus money purchasing it. I think that's interesting. I mean, the Star Trooper stuff. I'm not totally sure. I'm not saying that it's like the perfect model or anything, but I do think some sort of governmental structure that can ensure that people have more skin in the game is useful. So at least as a thought experiment, the service guarantee citizenship thing I think is kind of interesting. Do you have anything to say about that?
I mean, there are definitely many ways to organize a better government than what we have now. Democracy is the worst form of government. I would even say anti-government. I mean, I'm not particularly, married to neo-monarchism or neo-cameralism, whatever, but there are serious problems in our current system, and I'm open to alternatives.
Yeah, the 21st violinist for $2 says, freedom is when you get enslaved to your vices. Yeah, that is what big brain libertarians think. And also the 21st Violinist for $5 says, the 21st reaction, this stream includes enough wisdom and truth to be clipped on a COD daily. One can only hope. Okay, FaceTube my bleep for 50 Danish kroner, I think, says this one is for Sargon. Sorry, can't do that. He's gone. And okay, I'm not going to read the rest of the comment either. It's not even that edgy, but he's not even here, so there's no point. Aristocratic Owl for $5 says for Aristocratic Owl for $5 says, question for Charlemagne, how does the Discord alternative go?
Oh, it's making progress. I mean, so me and a few other people are working on setting up a Discord alternative that we run, and is thus safe from pretty much any form of censorship that we should encounter. So I'll put out more news on that, or let you know when more news on that occurs. But yeah, I've been shadow banned on Discord or something. A lot of people were hit by this weird phone number thing a few days ago. So I'm pretty much off Discord now. I'm not going back onto Discord. I'm going to build a community on this alternative platform that we're spinning up that, we have ownership over, to the extent where, I have direct access to the database and that sort of thing. So, it's going to be for real. It's going to be for people like us who need a safe place to build our communities. And there will definitely be announcements on that in the hopefully near future.
Yeah, okay, sounds cool. And another $5 from Jedi Knight Anathan Cringewalker. Foreign university admissions to Ivy League are down from 60 to 90% for the next year. What will the collapse of the university do for the cathedral? I don't know. I'm kind of skeptical that will be an actual collapse of the cathedral. I guess we'll see, but I think this is more just a short term, because of the current world crisis, just short term things. As long as all the same mechanisms are there to promote mainstream universities and to make them be so important in the culture, I think they'll still retain more or less their same position. And I'm sure they'll have no problem getting any sort of bailouts from the government if they run into financial issues. Window Lick for $5. Great stream. Cheers, y'all. Thanks. Will for $5. I think you should. I think you should do it on Sargon's channel next time. You'll probably get more exposure and more people to hear the ideas. I'd definitely be happy to do it on Sargon's channel if that was an option.
Yeah, that's kind of up to him, right?
Yeah. TSUA for $10 says, good stream. Sargon was much more receptive than I thought he would be. Can't wait for the next stream. And Aristocratic Owl for $2 says, can you guys hop into Canis Prime server later? I guess Charlemagne says he's done with Discord. I'll be on my server probably as soon as this is done. So yeah, you can chat with me there if you want. So yeah, that's just make sure there aren't any last minute super chats. Nope, that's it. Yep, so that's it, guys. Thank you everyone for watching, and thank you for listening to me stutter through those super chats. Yeah, bye.